Thank you for taking the time out of your busy day for this important report launch and discussion. I would like to first and foremost acknowledge the work we do takes place on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, which is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Our partners across Canada similarly gather on the traditional territory of many of Canada's Indigenous nations who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. We at the Ontario Chamber of Commerce are proud event partner of this event today in the report. Enormous praise, thanks, and respect to our friends at Ryerson's Diversity Institute and TD Bank for their incredible work to make this report launch and this discussion possible. Both organizations do tremendous work to advance diversity and inclusion right across Canada. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And if you've not read the report yet, you'll be receiving it via email, but it's also on the Ryerson website. So that's ryerson.ca/diversity/reports. So you can go take a look at the report there. Now, diversity in leadership not only singles who belongs or the right thing to do, but is also linked to organizations' performance on multiple levels. So there's extensive literature on the business case for diversity, when the benefits of diversity on boards of organizations and corporate C-suites. So these studies have suggested that more diverse boards are associated with an increase of firm value, and that firms with more diversity outperform those with less. So quick housekeeping before we kick things off. This event runs to 2:30. We have an exceptional group of speakers and panelists for our discussion today. And if you have any questions or wish to direct them to any of the panelists or speakers, you may do so in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. And if you want to direct a question to someone specific, please also do so and we'll call upon you, or we'll read your question. Now it gives me a sincere pleasure to introduce Canada's Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, the Honourable Bardish Chagger. Elected in 2015 as the Member of Parliament for Waterloo, she's devoted to inclusion and community building. Minister, sincere thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us, and thank you for your government's commitment and leadership to diversity and inclusion across Canada. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you so much, Michelle. This is such an exciting conversation, and I am so happy to be part of it. And so when I received the invitation, it was a quick yes. And it's so fitting that we are having this conversation. I want to acknowledge that I'm joining you from Waterloo, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Neutral people. And I think it's important that we take time to acknowledge the land, because we need to know our past, our true history, in order to actually have a clear vision as to where we're headed. And we clearly have a lot more work to do. So I'm looking forward to participating in today's discussion and hearing about the most recent findings of the DiversityLeads Diversity on Boards multi-city study. I'm sure that these findings will give us a lot to talk about as far as the steps that both the private sector and governments are taking to build and improve diversity and inclusion within boards and senior leadership. Events over the past week and months have shown us that this conversation is more vital and important than ever. There have been calls to action to end racism in all of its forms, including systemic racism that exists within our institutions. We have witnessed the social and economic disparities that have been laid bare by the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on equity-seeking communities. We still have a lot more work to do. More importantly, it tells us that the time to act is right now. In this cultural moment, more people than ever before are having an awakening about what is happening and what their role is in building a more inclusive and even better and stronger Canada. As Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said, we can't pretend that systemic racism doesn't exist in Canada. We also cannot ignore the crucial importance of diversity and inclusion, or lack thereof, at the highest levels of leadership in our governments and throughout our societies. Meaningful inclusion means a seat at the decision-making table, being seen and being heard. When individuals at decision-making tables are not diverse, we risk building Canadian institutions, legislation, and cities that exclude entire groups of people and perpetuate inequity. That's at the core of systemic racism. There is momentum for change and improvement across all sectors when it comes to diversity and inclusion. In Canada, there has been considerable focus placed on equality and representation and ways to advance women and underrepresented groups to leadership positions. And over the past few years, we've made strides in terms of representation of women in senior leadership roles. Still, change has been slow in coming, particularly when it comes to representation by women of color and Indigenous women. The results from last year's DiversityLeads Diversity on Boards multi-city study showed that we have not yet achieved gender parity in senior leadership. They also highlighted the fact that racialized Canadians are woefully underrepresented in senior ranks. In particular, the corporate sector remains the sector with the lowest amount of women, racialized Canadians, and Indigenous people in positions of leadership. Much more can and should be done to correct these gaps. I'm eager to hear from the Diversity Institute on the latest findings of the study. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to see the encouraging signs of further progress towards better and more equitable representation. I'm also keen to discuss the early and potential impacts of Bill C-25. As you all know, this legislation took effect at the start of this year. It requires federally incorporated businesses to report diversity on their boards and in their senior leadership to shareholders and the federal government. And if not, they have to explain why not. This should incentivize companies who have not yet developed a diversity and inclusion plan to make doing so a priority. Ultimately, these changes are not just good for society, they're good for the individual businesses and the wider economy. Companies and organizations that reflect society perform better. A 2018 study found that companies that have more diverse management teams have 19% higher revenue due to increased innovation. Similarly, a study by the McKinsey Institute found that companies that had more racial and gender diversity had significantly higher financial returns than those that did not. So, as Michelle shared in her opening comments, diversity doesn't just make good sense. It makes good business sense. Diversity is more than the shells that we occupy. It's about diversity of languages, regions, perspectives, of lived experiences, and so much more. A diverse leadership group brings with it different ideas and different approaches that are more innovative and further reaching. I truly believe that if we're going to succeed, it is crucial that both the private and public sector collaborate to remove the barriers that still prevent many Canadians from contributing fully to our society. We have to lead by example from the top down. Within government, we continue to work hard to ensure that our decision-making table reflects the diversity of Canada. This means fine-tuning our appointment process and, among other things, creating more advancement opportunities for people of diverse backgrounds, including Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples. As Minister of Diversity and Inclusion and Youth, my responsibilities include working with every federal department, agency, and minister to ensure that decisions are made with diversity and inclusion in mind. We are improving policies, initiatives, and practices in our own federal institutions, and we know that these efforts need to be accelerated and informed by lived experiences. Through Canada's anti-racism strategy, we established the Anti-Racism Secretariat. The Secretariat is engaging at all levels of government, civil society, Indigenous peoples, the business community, the labor sector, and diverse communities. We need to identify systemic barriers and gaps in federal policy programs and services, kickstart new initiatives, and further develop areas for action. It's my goal to make sure that the Anti-Racism Secretariat is part of every single policy and decision we make from all departments and agencies. There's a lot more work to do, and we're committed to doing that work as allies and partners with communities, businesses, organizations, and institutions. Diversity is and always has been one of our greatest strengths in Canada. It's the recipe for success and prosperity. So we really do need to maximize the use of that diversity, and currently we have not done that as well as we can. By embracing diversity and working together, we will make our country better, safer, and stronger for everyone. So thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Minister, for your remarks and being such a strong champion for diversity and inclusion in Canada. I saw in one of your statements that you had said, Canada's diversity is our strength, and we are strong not in spite of our differences, but because of them. And I thought that was very beautiful. And we just appreciate all the work you're doing. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Now it's my sincere pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Wendy Cukier. She's going to provide an overview of the report findings, and it's just, She's the founder of Ryerson's University Diversity Institute, an incredible advocate. It has been a sincere pleasure to get to know her more over the last year, and she's spent her time dedicated to many projects aimed at promoting the participation and advancement of underrepresented groups. So thank you so much. Looking forward to your presentation, Doctor. Can you unmute first?
Thank you so much, Michelle, and thank you, Minister Chagger. So just give me one moment to set this up. So I'm going to try to give you quick highlights on the study and the results, and really just set the stage for the panel discussion, which is really the highlight of the event. I think the minister gave an excellent explanation of the business case for diversity. It isn't to say that the human rights and equity case is not important, but we need to make sure organizations understand that diversity and inclusion will actually advance their organizational objectives. So I won't dwell on that. But I do want to emphasize the importance of measurement. We know that what gets measured gets done. It increases transparency and scrutiny. It helps us benchmark. You can't set a strategy if you don't know where you're starting. And that's why Bill C-25, which the minister mentioned, is so very, very important, because for the first time, 55% of companies in Canada will be required to report on diversity and inclusion and to have a strategy for advancing them. Our view is the legislation makes Canada a global leader in this area. It's the first country to include more than gender in its reporting requirements. So Bill C-25 requires reporting on the proportion of women, Indigenous people, racialized people, and persons with disabilities on boards and in senior leadership roles, as well as strategies to advance them. And we're very committed, as is the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, to help organizations implement the legislation and meet their commitments. So our study. This is research we've been doing for more than 10 years. We examined almost 10,000 board members across 5 sectors in 8 cities to look at the proportion of women and racialized minorities in leadership roles. Our methodology does not allow us to track persons with disabilities and Indigenous people, so we did other research to complement the metrics. After the George Floyd murder, we went back and we reanalyzed our data to look specifically at the proportion of Black people who are on boards. And we looked at boards across sectors. We looked at corporate boards. We looked at large voluntary organizations, educational institutions, hospitals, agencies, boards, and commissions in 8 cities across Canada. The reason why we thought it was critically important to look at representation of the Black community is the evidence is clear that anti-Black racism is real. Our 2017 study on the Black Experience Project provided extensive data on this, and recent events have reinforced its importance. We've talked for many years about the fact that the visible minority category, or racialized people, or people of color, masks important differences between different groups. And so we felt it was important to address this head on. We also recognize that context matters. So a city like Toronto and Vancouver, for example, almost half of the population is racialized. We had therefore set higher standards. We have higher expectations for organizations headquartered in those cities than compared to, say, London, Ontario, or Halifax or Hamilton, where the proportion is much smaller. But when we look at the representation of women, racialized people, and Black people in each of those cities, some things jump out immediately. Women are still underrepresented, but they are starting to make strides in most sectors other than the corporate sector. So you can see that, for example, in most cities, women represent close to 40% of people on boards. One of the reasons why I need to mention Ottawa, Halifax, London, and Hamilton are higher is because in those cities we did not look at the corporate sector. When we look, however, at racialized people, the picture is far worse. And you can see very clearly that in cities, as I mentioned, like Vancouver and Toronto, half of the population is racialized, and yet the representation on boards is far lower. And when we look at people who are Black, the situation is horrifying. In fact, when we looked at corporate boards, we were only able to identify 13 Black people in all of the cities that we studied. We also conducted interviews with 36 individuals who identified as Indigenous, LGBTQ2+, or persons with disabilities. And our findings overall are here. Across the cities that we looked at, as I mentioned, women have made progress. We still have not achieved parity. When we look at racialized people, the progress has been far less. And in fact, in some cities, there's a very long way to go. And when we look at specifically at Black people, you can see the underrepresentation relative to the population is the lowest of all. When we look across sectors, there's also important information that we need to bear in mind, because very often we hear that there's a problem with the pool. I can tell you there is no problem with the pool. When you see that municipal agencies, boards and commissions, provincial agencies, boards and commissions, the voluntary sector, universities and colleges and hospitals, all which are filled with large, complex organizations, are getting closer and closer to parity, it's very hard to understand why the corporate sector is still relatively low, even though progress has been made. And when we look at the representation of racialized people, as I mentioned, the situation is far worse. And again, in the corporate sector, the level of underrepresentation is particularly bad. If we look city by city, we can see again huge gaps. Let me focus your attention on the city of Toronto, for instance. So in the city of Toronto, roughly half the population is female. We've achieved close to 40% representation on boards. In the city of Toronto, half the population is racialized, and we only have 15.5% representation on boards. Look at where we are in the city of Montreal. Again, over 20%, about 25% of the population is racialized, and yet only 6.2% of people we identified on boards were racialized. So the gaps are acute, they're profound, and the systemic barriers, systemic discrimination, and racism are not figments of anyone's imagination. They're manifest in the data. When we look at the Black population, as I said, the picture is appalling. In the city of Toronto, where 7.5% of the population is Black, Black people represent 0.1% on boards of directors in the corporate sector. And as I mentioned, across the country, looking at more than 1,000 corporate board members, where we're only able to identify 13 who were Black. We also see these tremendous differences between sectors. And again, this points to the fact that the issue is not the availability of leaders. The issue is how we define leaders, how we define credentials, how we look at skills, and how we make decisions. So women have almost achieved parity, for instance, in leadership of school boards. And as I mentioned before, they're still significantly underrepresented on corporate boards. Similarly, when we look at racialized people, we see that municipal agencies, boards, and commissions are getting close to the level of representation in the population, but corporate boards of directors are sadly lagging behind. And I won't dwell on this, but we can also see that there are significant differences between cities, sometimes tied to the sector. So for example, in Calgary, where there's a heavy emphasis on resources, we see an even lower percentage of women than in Toronto, where we have a high concentration of financial institutions, which tend to do better. One of the things that this study has really highlighted, and I've worked for more than 30 years on issues related to gender and women in technology, is the importance of having an intersectional lens when we look at these issues. So in the city of Toronto, for example, where for every white woman, there is a racialized woman, white women outnumber racialized women by more than 10 to 1. And that is worse as we go across the country. When we look also within sectors, we see incredible differences. So when people say they would love to have more women on boards, they can't find any, I point you to the fact that 18.9% of the corporations that we looked at had at least 40% women on their boards. And yet 5% in Toronto still have none. That tells you it is not the pool, it's the intentionality, it's the processes, it's the policies. So if you see that some boards have achieved 20 or 30 or 40% in terms of the participation of women and racialized people, and others, for example, corporate boards in Vancouver have almost 3/4 of them have no racialized people. You know, the problem is not the pool, the problem is the process. So when we interviewed others about what some of the barriers were, because remember we could not use our methodology to track Indigenous people, people with disabilities, or LGBTQ2+ identifying people, and they're virtually invisible when you do look at the numbers. We asked about their perceptions. And their perceptions were that there were significant barriers in terms of corporate culture. There were significant barriers in terms of the way in which the criteria were identified. And there were significant barriers in terms of things like microaggressions. So sometimes they would get through the door, but they would never feel like they belonged. And I refer you to the two quotations where one of the respondents said, "What I came to recognize was it was harder for me to integrate into leadership positions because there's a whole part of me that I kept very separate from work." And Colin Druin, when he looked at our results, sent me an email and he said, "I had early in my career shared the same wisdom. Hide who you are until you get promoted so high. They can't get rid of you without people noticing." It's a terrible way to proceed. And it reminds me of research we did looking at people who self-identified as Muslims. There were stories of people telling their friends and colleagues they were recovering alcoholics to explain why they were drinking rather than to reveal their religious affiliations. We have to do better. We know that often board recruitment is based on informal networks rather than fair and transparent processes. That becomes a barrier if you're not part of those networks. And we know that intersecting identities present multiple barriers. It's all not doom and gloom, however. We do believe that we are making progress. We do believe that we are advancing in our understanding of the problem and what needs to happen to move things forward. As we discussed, the legislation is critical. Combating stereotypes is critical. Awareness of the problem is critical. At the organizational level, we need strategies that embrace every part of the organization. This is not just a board issue or an HR issue. This has to address every aspect of the value chain. And when it comes to governance, we can do better. We can set targets. We can communicate the strategic importance of diversity and inclusion. We can challenge the assumptions about the skills that are required. Running a hospital is way more complicated, as Paulette will confirm, than running a lot of private sector companies. So why is not service in a hospital, executive participation in a hospital, viewed as good training for a corporate board? And of course, at the end of the day, it all comes down to individual actions. We need to serve as mentors and sponsors. We need to promote people, and we can't stand by and watch unfair policies, stereotypes, and microaggressions. So the Diversity Institute is committed to working on the implementation of C25, to challenging stereotypes with our See It, Be It campaigns, to actively sponsoring diverse board candidates, to mainstreaming our diversity assessment tools, and to doing more research on what works. I want to thank TD Bank Group for sponsoring this initiative, along with many, many partners, including the Ontario Chamber of Commerce. And thank you very, very much to all of you for attending this important workshop today.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. And I agree with you. As I was reading it, we're seeing some progress for women after decades of advocacy, but other diverse groups are facing even more barriers. And I kept saying to myself that we can do so much better. And I hope we continue to push and make change. One of the questions, just before I go over into the panel discussion, Wendy, there's some questions about other cities that aren't in the report. Could you just speak a little bit and let the group know, our audience members know, what cities are next, or why did you choose the cities you chose and all that?
Thanks very much. So it's funny because we've already had requests to, for example, collect data on the city of Winnipeg. My colleague and co-conspirator, Suzanne Gagnon, is at the University of Manitoba. We're committed to doing that. We've been asked to do work in the city of Kingston. The methodology is not hard to apply, so if there's interest, we're more than happy to work with people to collect more data and to share it.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Now I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce this incredible group of panelists. I don't even know where to begin. I'm completely in awe of what they've accomplished professionally in their activity and involvement serving their communities. And what they have in common is their strong commitment and passion for diversity, inclusion, and equality. Please join me in welcoming an esteemed panel of experts. Claudette McGowan, who's Global Executive Officer, Protect Fusion and Cyber Experience at TD Bank. And again, thank you for supporting and partnering on the report and launch. Paulette Senior, CEO and President, Canadian Women's Foundation. Marianne Smith, partner at Blake, Castles and Graydon LLP. And Desiree Norwegian, who's owner of Abraflex. Now, let's dive in, shall we? So if everyone can take themselves off mute, I'm really looking forward to this discussion. So first of all, I'm just going to go to a question to the crowd. I'm going to call upon you. So let's talk about the results of the study. Did they surprise you? Did anything shock you? Did anything really stick out? I'm going to kick it off with Marianne, if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for including me in this exciting panel today. I'm sorry to say not too much surprised me in the report. I'm probably naturally a cynical person, so that's probably why. I think as Wendy mentioned and you mentioned in your remarks, it is good to see some progress that is being made, but obviously some things need to improve. I was particularly interested in the qualitative portion of the study and some of the anecdotal stories about actually people holding themselves back because of perceived barriers. So I don't believe I have the skills to take on this board role. I believe I don't have the financial capacity to take on this position. I think that really tells us a lot about some of those structural barriers that exist that are going to be difficult to overcome. And I think that was it wasn't surprising to me, but that was actually very telling, because a lot of, I think a lot of people, and as women, sometimes we do that too, right? We hold ourselves back because we don't think we're good enough or smart enough or any of those things. And so I think that was, for me, that was a particularly telling part. And I think that's good because it actually allows us to get maybe into the mindset of those people, and that will actually help us come up with solutions, I think, to realize it's not just a matter of, circulating advertisements to a broader audience. If people are reading that description and saying, I can't see myself there, right? So I think it's very telling in that way.
Yeah, I agree. That really popped out for me. And I think we've all suffered from imposter syndrome at one point or another during our career. So those stories really spoke to me. Claudette, do you have some comments to weigh in on the study results?
Yeah, first of all, I just think it's a great body of work, and I'm really pleased to see it come to life. It really does shine a light on where we are today. I think it's remarkable that the people that we call visible are invisible in so many different realms around the tables where decisions are made. And I think this is about shining that light and moving things forward. So I'm not surprised at what I see, but at the same time, I'm excited about the possibility to just apply more intention to doing what we need to do to get to where we need to go. Yeah,
well said. And it's such a timely report, isn't it? With everything that's happening, it's just, I was reading it and I was like, we need this right now to help us all drive change and take action. And the cool, for the audience that's watching right now, this panel is different. We have different sectors and different backgrounds. So the perspectives we're going to get from this panel today is going to be incredible. So I'm super excited. Desiree wanted to talk to you about the results of the study. Anything that really stuck? Because I have a couple things that stick in my head about it. How about you?
It definitely wasn't a surprise. As I am in the nuclear industry, so most events I attend, or 70% of them are my male counterparts, right? And only 30% represent the women in the nuclear industry. And it's great to see that we are making strides and people are coming together and realizing it. And really, we have to thank, in my organizations anyways, the male counterparts that I have that are huge supporters of mine. I really do have to thank them because they're the ones who have really pushed me to where I am today. So it's definitely not a surprise, but I'm glad to see that we're going in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that having that, to your point, having that peer network that does encourage you to get what Marianne referred to as people getting stuck in their heads of like, I don't know, I'm not sure. I think having that network that encourages and pushes and helps remove those barriers that we create for ourselves is important. So I'm glad to hear you have good support in a male-dominated industry, because we've all experienced different support structures that have helped us further along in our careers. Paulette, last but not least on this subject, let's talk about the results. What did you think?
Well, as you can imagine, I have much I could say, but I think some of the words that Wendy used in her presentation are telling. She used words such as acute, profound, appalling. And I think for me that wraps up in a bundle my impression of the results. First of all, it's great to be doing this work, and it's good to have it come out now, because I think it adds to the body of work that's sorely needed. But in terms of my thoughts around the results, I am disheartened. To be honest, I am disappointed, and I am not surprised.
Yeah.
And the combination of those feelings leaves me quite perplexed as to really trying to understand what else do we need to say, to do, to demonstrate, to show, to prove that this is a pressing issue. Must it take a pandemic within a pandemic in order for us to move on this issue? Is it time to move beyond words and declarations to showing us the actions that you're taking? And so when I think about what the results are telling me is that also, as Wendy was saying, that there's lack of intentionality. And so my hope, if we have to move to hope, because it's hard to sit and remain in the discomfort and the disheartenment and the disappointment. It's hard to sit in that, but I think we have to, because as Canadians, we like to paint things over as if they didn't exist, as if we didn't see them, as if it's not that bad. Well, it is that bad. And I think we should sit in that discomfort and understand that it is linked to what we're seeing in terms of unrest. It is linked to every other system of oppression on people's lives, on Black bodies. And so it's important to sink that in and live with it. And throw away this mentality that we're not as bad as those guys to the south, right? It's time to throw that out and admit that the evidence we're seeing there is the exact same experience here. So I think that's where we are, and that's what I think of the results.
And you're bang on. I'm going to stick with you actually, because this actually transitions perfectly into our next discussion. But I'm also going. It is the pandemic in the pandemic, and we do need to sit in discomfort because we need to do change that will take place and not just talk about it. So I think probably everyone's nodding their heads. The whole audience is probably just nodding their heads right now with what you just said. So thank you for your comments. So I'm gonna keep with you, Paulette. We're gonna talk about current events because you've already alluded to it a bit. So we have a global spotlight that's shone on the United States, the wake of the death of George Floyd in the spring. And then this light made its way to Canada. So it not only illuminated our shameful past and present with systemic anti-Black and anti-Indigenous racism, but also exposed how little Canadians knew about it. And then we have the pandemic that's had a disproportionate effect on a number of populations, disadvantaged women, entrepreneurs. So let's just discuss what impacts. So let's just take your comments and let's go a little bit deeper. So what impacts or foreseeable impacts can these current affairs have when it comes to moving that dial in senior positions?
It's a big question, and first let me say that you're right. Seeing what happened to George Floyd was an impetus for what we're seeing within in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and so for me. I think it's important to understand that in Canada, these issues were happening. Seeing it live with George Floyd was a shock to all our systems, but the critical piece for me around what we are seeing in terms of the impact is that it's opening up on so many levels the chasms that have always existed, whether you're looking at gender, whether you're looking at the intersectionality of many of these issues. It's opening them up so we can actually see them. We have always known that our Indigenous brothers and sisters have always been experiencing serious disenfranchisement in society. We have always known that. Maybe we were able to live our lives well and compartmentalize without having to pay attention to it, but it was always there. We have had 400 years of discrimination and racism in this country against Black people, right? So it's always been a problem. Having disaggregated data the way that we do now, I think proves what many advocates have tirelessly been talking about and been saying. And the collection of this data, I think, broken down by race, culture, gender, and other kinds of identities, is critical in not only being able to face the truth about the reality of what we have in Canada as a society, but it's also about being able to fix the problem, to address the problem, to put in place the kinds of responses and build better coming out of a pandemic. So if I were to talk about hope, which I try not to talk about because sometimes we can brush over a serious conversation when we talk about, so what do we hope for? And that's not where I want to go. But what I want to say is that I am hopeful then that seeing the truth, we can deal with it and we can build better. We can actually, we have a series of papers we're doing at the Canadian Women's Foundation that's called Resetting Normal. To me, this is an opportunity to take that truth and reset the reality and the future that we want to live in. And that's what my hope is. So we're seeing that it is indeed possible to build better. And the way I know that is because in the twinkle of an eye, we were all able around the world to shift our behavior to make sure that we were safe and our loved ones were safe. We shut things down. We're capable of significant change as a people, as human beings. So what that tells me is that we're capable of shifting the reality of what we have built around discriminatory and racist practices in this country. And so because I know we're capable now of embracing the truth of the disaggregated data and then being able to build better. So isn't that something to be hopeful for?
I love that. And I actually never, I love you know, science and data behind change management and how humans react to different things. But I never thought about it in the context of, you know, we were able to make a significant change during this pandemic. So there is an opportunity for us to be able to do that when it comes to representation in senior leadership positions and boards. Thank you. I really, really, really liked your remarks. And I mentioned a couple current affairs to set up that conversation with the panelists, but you know, we can also deep dive into other happenings. So I'm just going to go over to Desiree to get your take on, you know, the impacts of current affairs and what that means.
Well, from where I see it, I'm from Lidley First Nation. I'm Dene. So I deal lots with the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business. They have some amazing resources and have done a lot of different things, a lot of great things. They've been talking with the government on changing things and they're really connecting the corporate world with the Indigenous world, not just businesses, but the people, right? And that's what it's all about. It's all about the people. So the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business has done amazing work with where we are in the pandemic, how we're going to move through. Another movement is Equal by 30, which is the international movement for gender equality. So I do see that there are things in the works and things are starting to move. And you are absolutely correct, Paulette. We are capable of change, and change is coming. But we all have to be pushing in the right direction and rowing in the same direction, right? So I think it's everybody's had to stay home for the last 6 months and really think about where they're at and their family. And it's the people that make us Canada. And together, we'll all get there.
It is the people that make us a great nation. I love that. And thank you for your comments, Desiree. Marianne, what's your take?
Yeah, I think along the lines of what both Paulette and Desiree were saying, I think this, to me, this is a reflective moment. I think it's very interesting. On the one hand, we sort of have this this global health crisis, but it's really created an opportunity, I think, and some of the events with the protests, I think it actually has caused a moment of pause and reflection. And I think, and I think that what Paulette said is so great. Let's never again agree with someone who says we can't make pretty dramatic changes in a short period of time because somehow human beings can't do that, right? Let's remember this. I mean, I'm sure none of us will forget this, but let's remember that, right? Let's remember that we actually can do it, and don't let people tell us that we can't. And I think this is a good opportunity. I mean, I work in a client service focused business, and certainly our clients, they're using this moment of reflection themselves too, right? And so they ask themselves, what kind of service provider do I want in my business? When we have times like this in the global economy as well, people do make some change organizationally, and they do look at their service providers and say, who do I want on my side? And increasingly and thankfully, people are making business decisions based on things related to diversity and inclusion. And I think this is also a moment of opportunity for that as well. And so, yeah, let's never forget the art of the possible coming out of COVID, for sure. And let's seize on that opportunity.
100%. And I said it earlier, Minister said it earlier, but it's not just good sense, it's good business sense. It helps the bottom line. And companies across the world set KPIs for their revenue targets. If they want to achieve those faster, they can make sure that they're looking at their representation in senior positions. So, and I know TD has done some really incredible, TD Bank has done incredible work in this space. Claudette, looking at you to give the final remarks on this subject, and then we're going to move on to another discussion area.
Yeah, I'd say Paulette said it best about moving past hope, and it's time for action. And so when I think about what's happened over the last couple of months, we're seeing people wake up, speak up, and step up. And that's really different. I think people have always kind of known, but what do we actually do about it? Yeah. And so we're seeing collective leadership. TD, I love what's happening at TD, and it's happening from the top of the house. We're having conversations, we're listening, because that's really important to make sure that every voice is being heard. We're making sure that programs are developed as a result of the words that we're hearing and the feelings, because a lot of feelings are coming out as well. It's like, yeah, I'm here, but how does it feel to be here? And what kind of things can be put around me to make me more successful? And so, of course, investing money, is really big. Over $16 million invested in 2020 to help out the Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and focusing on inside, because you can't do all this stuff outside and not think about what happens to the folks that are in the organization. So double clicking on your colleagues that work at TD Bank, double clicking on your customers and clients, and then of course the communities where we serve. So I'm just loving just the focus that we're not just talking about things. I see the action.
Yeah, and I actually point to a lot of colleagues, friends to TD because they truly walk the talk. And And it's important because if you have employees seeing, you know, all these wonderful CSR initiatives where companies are doing wonderful initiatives outside the organization, but they're not doing it for their people, it has such a negative effect on an organization. So terrific work that you guys are doing. Thank you.
And still more to be done, and still more to be done, to be quite frank.
Always.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%. So I'm going to go back to Desiree. I want to talk about now with the group, what are some of the strategies that we are working in, that are working in terms of increasing inclusion on boards and within executive leadership, especially being from the nuclear industry? I'd love to hear your take on this.
Thank you, Michelle. Some of the biggest things that I see happening, and a lot of it has to do with personal networking, right? In my experience, I sit on 3 different boards, all non-for-profit, but a lot of it is networking and the people you know. So how do I connect, right? If you ask somebody else, how do I connect with the people who make these decisions? Because that's ultimately where you have to get to. So when I look back at my career and people I've ran into, one of the organizations I'm sit on the board for is the Canadian Council of Aboriginal Business, and they on the Indigenous front are doing amazing work. They have a progressive Aboriginal program, which is Canada's premier program for Aboriginal relations. The 4 performance areas of PAR help companies assess and improve their Aboriginal relationship policies and signal to communities that they're committed to the prosperity of Aboriginal communities. So with their work on this front alone, in the Indigenous realm, there are a lot of gold standard companies, as they would call them. For instance, Bruce Power in the nuclear industry, and some of their targets, and they've set some pretty expansive targets that they on employment, on buying from Indigenous companies, from promoting people from within. So there is work being done. Sometimes it just needs to be brought to the forefront, and so people can see it, right? That there is work being done. There are resources out there. There are lots of different things that I could name, and a lot of different people, a lot of different organizations, but Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business is definitely the #1 that comes to mind when I think about Indigenous relationships. Just because they also hold the big networking events, right? So a lot of the people I've met and a lot of great people that have brought me forward in my career have been through networking. And that's what I found has been my biggest, the biggest impact that I've had in sitting on boards and really doing what you say you're gonna do. So making sure, yeah, I sit on treasurer for 2 of them. I sit on Indigenous engagement committees for all of them. So it's doing what you say you're gonna do and really caring. You know, if you have that, if you really care about something, you push forward and you push further. So I see it really changing, and I think it's gonna be really exciting to see what's gonna happen over the next 5 years even. I talked to a lot of girlfriends who've, you know, they've been doing the gender equality push for years. And I actually had one tell me this summer, she said, I'm really disappointed. She goes, we've been doing this for 20 years. She goes, and I still feel like the needle isn't moving. And looking at this report, it is slowly moving, but it isn't anywhere near where it should be. And that change is coming. It's coming.
Awesome. Tabitha, actually, the president of CAB, is on the OCC board, and Bruce Power is a member, so I'm familiar with their great program with Indigenous partners, and how far they've brought that relationship to have real strong, positive community involvement and skills development programs. So it's great to see. And the report itself mentions how, you know, it comes from the top, so you can see it, right? Yeah. Marianne, can you shed some light on some of the strategies that are working in terms of increasing inclusion on boards and in executive leadership?
Yeah, I would say 2 things, sort of drawing on what Desiree said earlier. We need our allies and our sponsors, not only at an individual level, and I think everyone understands what individual mentorship and sponsorship means and how important that is, particularly, you know, to help us get over our imposter syndrome for sure, and to help us with our personal networks. But also we need our mentors and our sponsors to create space within our organizations to have these discussions and to have some uncomfortable discussions, right? I think, you know, particularly in the corporate world, we need to start having some uncomfortable discussions about why it is that the needle is not moving the way it should be. And, you know, in order to have a safe space to have those discussions, you need to have leadership within the organization that creates those spaces. And then the other thing I've observed, you know, spending years working in a Bay Street law firm, is that we also need to look at the pipeline, right? We are not changing the face of Bay Street law firms by simply doing the same things we have been doing for the last 20 years, because that doesn't work. And I've been involved in recruiting for the firm for a number of years, and we actually need to go and focus on pipeline activities. We need to actually convince racialized people, LGBTQ2S students, people from underrepresented groups and marginalized groups. We need to convince them to go to law school, right? Like it does us no good to go to a law school and say, where are all the racialized people? Where are all the underrepresented people? Well, they're not there because they actually decided not to go to law school 3 years ago. So we actually realized you can't just go to law school and expect those people to be there. You actually have to go and show them and be the person they can look at and say, hey, that person is a lawyer, I can be a lawyer. And so I think, you know, to translate that to leadership, we also have to, you know, work on our leadership pipelines. And if we can't show someone the exact person that is like them because they don't exist in leadership positions, we at least have to provide them with the tools and the confidence that they can actually do that. And so I think that's important. I think it's hard to, you know, say, I have a board, we need to find directors, and then to go out and say, but where is everyone, right? Sometimes we need to do some of that pipeline work to get ourselves in a position where we can find those people for those positions.
I love that. And I've actually talked to friends and colleagues about this subject quite a bit, because once you start actually looking at some of those pipelines of people building them up for an industry, you know, it almost starts in, you know, reaching out to them and nurturing that in elementary school or high school when they're starting to form their thoughts about the future or their interest, which is why it's, you know, it's always good when you see, you know, programs that are, you know, new programs that are coming out in education systems where it's focused on things like finance or entrepreneurship and things like that that weren't traditionally there. So thank you for your comments. That was really great to hear. Now I'm going to go over Claudette. Maybe you can share a little bit about what TD Bank does, or other examples you've seen of strategies where, you know, that are working in terms of increasing inclusion on boards and within executive leadership.
Yeah, I'm an advocate at TD Bank, really casting wide nets. So again, the whole notion of not looking in the same place, but really going across the country, across North America, wherever you serve, and making sure that you're tapping into those different communities. Some of the work that I've done in the past, and there was a whole conversation on pipeline, it's really, I think, making sure you know what is out there, what actually exists, because sometimes people will start things not recognizing that there are programs and initiatives. I think about med school. There's a gentleman named Ike Okafor who lifted the number of kids from med school from 1 a year at U of T to 20 a year, because he put a program in place to help people develop and grow and get access to that type of program. So I think it's really key that we look at what already is in place. So let's get the baseline of all the things that exist, and then also to take a look at the structural things that prevent us from moving forward. I think pipeline is certainly an element to look at, but also what are the different junctures that, you know, where it's difficult for people to move forward because the structure, the policies, the processes make it very difficult. So we are looking at things like that within TD Bank to say, what can we do internally around process and policy? Because sometimes the things that we're working toward were developed many, many moons ago. So I just encourage every leader to take a look at process, policy, and the structures.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Paulette? over to you.
Yeah, great to hear my co-panelists, you know, share different strategies, and I'm sure they're all effective in different ways. When I think about diversity and inclusion, you know, the whole work around inclusion is really about what actions are you taking to ensure that the table looks like the region that you're in, that it represents the people that are in society, or at least in your community. But when I think of what does inclusion lead to, it's supposed to lead to a sense of belonging. That's what it's supposed to lead to. And if people don't feel that they belong, then there's a much deeper problem. It's not, as someone said, a pipeline issue all the times. It may be sometimes, but it not always is. And it's also not a matter of the fact that folks don't exist. Because during this pandemic, what I have seen as someone who's been sort of an OG, I've been in this work a long time, and I've seen many things come and go, and people come and go, and lots of strategies. You know, I've been an advocate for a long time. So when I look around now and see the brilliance of Blackness that exists in all the different strategies and initiatives that are taking place, I am really proud that I don't have to be in the center of it. So I just want to say they're out there. Women are there, Indigenous people are there, Black folks are there. Where are you looking, and where are you not looking, right? And how are decision makers deciding who fits and doesn't fit? First of all, I hate that word fit, because it leaves so many people out, right? So I would say recalibrate about this whole notion of fit, and think about what is the culture that you want to build within your organization, within your institution? What's the culture that you want to build? What do you want to reflect? And when people are looking up and seeing those who are leading and making decisions, what message do you want them to leave with? So absolutely support the various initiatives around mentorship and sponsorship and pipeline and all of that, right? But what is it that we're trying to achieve? Let's be honest about that. And let's be honest about what we have been doing. Have we been sort of elbowing someone to say, come over, we're looking for someone, we have a vacancy? Let's be honest about the processes that we have been using, because they have been in place and the results are what we've got, right? So if the results are what we've got, then let's be transparent about the fact that it's not working to achieve what we say we want to achieve. And if we say we want to make a difference, then we actually have to apply a different set of strategies in order to get the results that we want. So, you know, I don't want to be listing off strategies necessarily. There are some that are really great, but think about the end result. You want to create a sense of belonging, because even if you get one or two people sitting around the table that are Indigenous or Black or, you know, disabled, how are you creating a sense of belonging for them so that they stay? And we have seen articles, whether it's in legal sector or the nonprofit sector, we're not that good at it either, right? Our numbers are not great. So, but we've seen various exposés that's happening. And it's happening in the women's sector, it's happening in the charitable sector, it's happening everywhere. All these exposés that the pandemic is sort of raising the profile on, and investigations are happening, and leaders are having to step aside because they either ignored or kept their heads down when people complained, or didn't even have a kind of process response to some of these complaints. So now is the time, I think, to actually seize the moment and really understand first what is happening in your institution, in your organizations, and what's the, and then tracing that back to the results you have, and then creating a goal around what is it that you want to happen, that you can create a sense of belonging, that folks can actually see themselves being there. And so Wendy said earlier, if you can't see it, you can't be it. Very true in most cases. Some of us have had to be it without seeing it and try to hold the fort, and that costs us a lot to keep it, and too much, in fact, in terms of the sacrifice, but we hold on, trying to keep that door open for others, and so that others can see it and become it. So yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah, it looks like there's a couple comments in the chat about, you know, how fit of an organization, you know, is challenging for, let me actually read it. It struck a chord with me. That fit, unfortunately, the corporate world is centered on fit. And I'll throw it actually back to the group before we move on to our next section. So let's go a little bit deeper into this. Do we think that mentality of corporations or organizations could change, is changing? I'll go back to you, Paulette, actually, to kick it off.
I think it's being challenged, right? So I think there are challenges that are happening now to that. And you know, the whole concept of fit, when you talk about recruitment and the whole recruitment process, I know that in my organization, we push back on that, because if I can't define it, or if I'm not going to be honest and define it, then what is it that I'm looking for? So I think that's really important, to really break that down a little bit and understand that when we talk about fit, perhaps we're talking about some intangible element of someone's identity and way of being that may have nothing to do with the job. Right?
Yeah,
so
I mean,
that's what
the only time I was told I was like not fit for the role was when I was getting a sweet kiss goodbye from a company, and it was their legal HR loophole. So, but yeah, I mean, seeing people not making the person fit the company, but maybe the company fit the person. Claudette, do you have thoughts on this idea of fit and culture when it comes to organizations?
Yeah, you said it. It's culture. So again, you have to look at the corporate or the organization and the culture there. The company that I work with today, it's not a one size fits all. You see different people, different ways they think, different ways they work, different ways they deliver their value. Even the fact that we have so many people working from home or working remotely right now, and bringing their full selves to work every day. So I think it's really specific on the organization, but I've certainly seen, like, industry-wide, just a move from, you know, it has to be the blue suit, you went to this school, you did this thing. It's really around what value do you bring, what results do you deliver? And I think I'm very, you know, bolstered by the fact that it is happening. It is a trend that is, to the earlier point, being challenged.
Thanks so much. Desiree, do you have thoughts on this, especially from the nuclear industry angle?
So I do, totally I do. And it always, yeah, the word fitting in doesn't usually apply to myself. And maybe it's because I don't actually like to fit in, right? And I don't think that having somebody fit into a mold, into a box, is what you want, because then you're going to get the same thing you've always had. And if you're looking to change and if you're looking to improve, you really need people who don't fit in that box, because you are where you are, right? So if you want change, you want things to move forward, you want to build your business bigger, you really need to find people who have a lot of different viewpoints and don't fit your mold.
Yeah. And then Marianne?
Yeah, I agree with everyone. And, you know, as Paulette says, we have to ourselves, when we hear people talking about fit and this person fits and that person maybe doesn't fit or that person makes me feel uncomfortable, we really need to push back. And those are difficult conversations. And so, as I said earlier, we need leaders within our organizations to create space for us to have those uncomfortable conversations. And I do think in the corporate world, fit is sort of an analogy for just like me. And so if we want to continue with some progress, then we have to push back at that. And I would really love us to stop talking about fit and just talking about what diversity of skills and knowledge and experience people can bring to the table.
This is certainly, there's a lot of good Q&A and comments coming up from people. They're asking different questions, you know, are recruitment firms part of the problem? You know, I think that everyone can do better no matter what industry or what sector. And I think you all agree because you're all nodding your heads along. So, but
can I chime in?
Of course, Minister.
I just want to chime in. I think it's also a matter of looking at what are you trying to build within your organization? Because we're having this conversation within the public service as well. As to where are we recruiting from and where are we bringing people in from? And then when we bring in the diversity and however you want to define it into that space, are we maximizing or utilizing that diversity? Or are we kind of like that cookie cutter model of making you be exactly what we've had a lot of? So if you want to embrace diversity, I think then you actually have to let that individual shine and contribute. And it's kind of like where the presentation earlier was shared, a person saying, look, I'm going to hide who I am and what I do so that I can get to myself, you know, advanced and so forth, and then they can't fire me. But that person should actually be brought in to bring that diversity so that you can have a better outcome and have better. So I think we also need to revisit our institutions in that sense. And I think that's across the board because some of the newer organizations and the ones who are staying current with time, just like Claudette said, they have new cultures and that culture is embracing diversity versus we have a lot of dated institutions that still kind of are based on the foundation of the men that came around to discuss Confederation. And those decisions are still being made by those very same 32 men. And that's a problem. So I just wanted to add that in.
Thanks so much, Minister. And I agree 100%. I worked at an international organization where my colleagues were from around the world. And they all ended up, you know, we actually, part of my job was internal communications. So we would actually leverage our employees to bring their experiences, their culture to the organization. So it kept that two-way loop. So we're constantly engaging and learning from each other. So, and understanding too, which is very important. So we're gonna have one, I think this is our last, I'm gonna look at questions after this too, but we're gonna move on to another topic. We're gonna kick things off with Mary Ann. Do you think there are differences in the experiences of people whose identities are less visible? What affects decisions to disclose or self-identify in your view?
Yeah, so I do think that on the one hand, for those of us who can cover our differences, you know, as a gay identified woman, obviously I can't cover the fact that I'm a woman, but I can cover the fact that I'm gay identified. And so on the one hand, it's a privilege because we can cover that difference. And so when fit is important, and if fit doesn't include being gay, then I can hide that difference, right? And so there is a certain privilege in being able to do that, and I recognize that. On the other hand, it does create its own challenges, right? Maybe there are opportunities, certainly in my professional career, there have been opportunities, and I've gotten involved with organizations that are queer identified, but obviously there's a calculus to be done every time, right? There's a calculus to be done about self-identifying, and then perhaps that opens a door, perhaps it closes other doors. You know, I have to do that all the time in my professional career with colleagues and clients. And so it's kind of a challenge of being comfortable and authentic to myself, but then also recognizing the challenges that come with it. And I think I've come to realize that that actually covering and being comfortable is not only doing a disservice to myself, but it's actually doing a disservice in particular to the younger generations, right? Because as Paulette said earlier, you know, I also haven't in my professional career had many people to look up to on Bay Street. And so I've also realized that I'm stealing that line, Paulette. I have to hold the door open for the younger generation, who frankly, among the younger generation, they don't want to be in the closet, right? They don't want to be in the closet. They don't want to cover. They want to be their authentic self. And so I feel like it's part of my responsibility to hold that door open. And so that means me being uncomfortable in some circumstances. So I think it is a challenge in those circumstances, but I think we do, you know, those of us who have some privilege have to use that privilege to keep that door open.
Nicely said. Yeah, for sure. Appreciate your comments on that. Because as I was reading the report, I kept remarking in areas too where there wasn't people self-reporting. So if you don't know the issues because people aren't self-reporting, then identifying how to make that change gets hard too for organizations, right? Paulette, looking for you to weigh in on this discussion.
I was just thinking that, Marianne, your response gave me the warm fuzzies.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
Yeah, because it's so true and so real. And it also makes me think of this dichotomy that those of us who are visible, as Claudette was saying, become or have to become invisibilized, right? Because not just the data shows that, but sometimes the way that we have to operate within spaces where we can't be our full authentic self, as you say, and then you can take your sort of other self or real self in other spaces. And then I think about the impact of that and carrying that throughout your career and what that's like. And yeah, I think I come from that generation where that happens and has happened quite a bit, whether it's how we wear our hair, right? Whether it's how we show up, it's whether we show up with our real food, or, you know, all these little elements that is part of who we are. And when we can't bring our full selves into a space, whether we're visible or invisible, it costs something. It costs us something along the way, but it also robs the people you're working with of actually getting to know who we really are in our fullness. So, you know, that's what I think about when I think about your response, Marianne, to that question, is what it robs all of us of when we can't bring our full selves into the spaces that we operate in, and probably where we spend, I don't know, 50% of our lives more doing the work that we do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I have these conversations with the girlfriends and well, friends writ large for things that can't be seen, and it's painful. It's painful for people. So it's certainly, I have hope for change. Desiree, did you want to comment here?
I'd love to. So there was a period, I'm sure, in my life where I wasn't forthcoming on being Indigenous and who I was. And I've lived out of my community for many years, since I was 3. And I always kept close contact with my grandmother, but really didn't feel that connection being out of my community, right? And knowing the things that my grandmother has done and the things that she could have taught me if I were close by. It was a decision out of my hands, but for many years I really hid that, and I didn't really celebrate the fact that I'm Indigenous. And any part of that, right? It's unnerving because there's so many things, so many more things I would have done if I would have opened up about it and been more places and seen more and experienced more and have that connection with more people as I went along the way. Now, since then, of course, I've changed, but it was hard. It was a hard period of time hiding who you are. So self-identifying isn't easy for every person. Every person comes from a different background. So it can't be easy trying to lie to people, right? Whether you're at work or whether you're at home, it's not something natural.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your comments. Really appreciate it. Claudette.
It's interesting. I was putting in a technology at a company where you'd have to put the person's picture with their messaging tool. So you'd see the face of who sent you the message. And lots of people asked me to take their picture down. They felt that if people saw what they looked like, they might not get the same level of partnership, support, and that was really telling. And so I think there's this hiding, you know, we talk about the visible part, but there's also like how you speak, how you interact. So there's a lot of things where I go back to culture. You have to have an organization that really supports you bringing your full self, and you'll know that you'll get that right level of care and feeding. And it's not going to be held against you, because the reasons why people don't count themselves in on the surveys and, you know, tick the box is because they're not sure what will happen when someone has that information. So we have to give people that psychological safety in organizations to really be their true selves.
Beautiful. Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. There's a nice note in the chat. My ask is that you do not forget those who paved the way and allow them to become part of the wonderful new experience of growth. It's a very nice message from Brenda. Thank you very much. We have a couple, I'm just taking a look at some of the questions. Seeing if there's one more question we wanted to get in. I'm keeping an eye on the time too for the audience. I think, you know what, I think we've covered a lot of these topics, but what I will do is ask for, I'm going to go through the panel and ask for a final words that you want to leave with the audience today, and then I'll wrap things up, okay? So I'm going to kick this off with Marianne.
Yeah, so I wrote down earlier from Wendy's presentation, no bystanders allowed. I think I might make a sign of that and put it on my door at the office. You know, we all have our part to play, and I think studies like this and panels like this, I always enjoy participating in them because there's so much food for thought. But I think we have to recognize that we all have our parts to play, and so let's none of us be bystanders.
Awesome, thank you. Claudette?
I think of it as a coalition, and we have to work together. So when I looked at the report that Wendy and team put together, it's about what can the individual do, what can the organization do, what can the community do, and it has to work in harmony. When I look at, you know, specifically around boards, work that's being led by people like Wes Hall, like you think about, it's really powerful that people are coming together. Organizations, our Coalition for Innovation Leaders Against Racism, multiple leaders from multiple industries coming together to move this dial. And so I think the number one message I want to say to everyone is no one person's going to do this on their own. No one organization is going to do it on its own. It's collectively working together.
Yes, well said. And actually someone had mentioned the Black North Summit Initiative. Wes Hall, we had the fortune to get to know over the last little bit. The Ontario Chamber partnered together, and he's holding corporations' feet to the fire and making sure that they put, you know, tangible commitments. So it's not just a pledge, but it is, these are your targets and these are your KPIs. So I really love what he's doing. Yeah, taking action. And that was like, that still gives me to see leaders from across Canada stand up and go, yeah, we're in. I still get chills about it because I'm so proud of that action being taken. Paulette, final words.
Sure. So there are a couple things, words that come to mind. I'm thinking about the unrest that we're experiencing across North America and different parts of the world right now related to the Black Lives Matter social justice movement. And I'm making the link to the conversation today and to the results that Wendy has shared with us. And I think it's important that we all make that link, that organizations, that leaders, decision makers make that link, because the unrest we're seeing is directly related to people being excluded and not included. And so, and I go back to the word of hopeful, but also the opportunity that we now have, that now that you have seen it, you can't unsee it. And so the action that should lead to is that we are making the change that we say we want to see.
Nice. All right, and Desiree.
So my biggest thought right now is that be the change, right? If you want to see change, get involved. Find people who are like-minded, who are looking to push that forward. And don't bring people down. As women, we compete already with our male counterparts, but we also compete with female counterparts for a small share in a board of director, right? So keep encouraging people, keep pushing people forward. It's going to change. Change is coming.
Yeah.
You got to be it.
Awesome. And Minister, did you want to say a final few words? I'm keeping my eye on the time, Wendy. Don't you worry.
I love to keep the door open. I'm going to hold that door open all the time.
I love that.
Flood in. So I've been writing notes. This was amazing. Really well done.
All the feels. So quickly, Wendy, did you want to say a few words or just want me to wrap it up? I just think it's incredible what the work from the Diversity Institute. This report was timely and shone the light, and we can use that to advocate going forward. And again, bravo to the Diversity Institute, the work you've been doing, and TD Bank for this partnership. Wendy, did you want to say a final remarks?
Really, I'm just very, very grateful for everybody's support and participation. Some of you I've been working with for more than a decade, and I share the feeling that there's some optimism, but we have to get real, and we have to name it as a problem. And just to echo Paulette's comment, Canadians are way too self-congratulatory.
Yeah.
Research, the Black Experience Project showed that half of the people who responded said Canada is no better than the United States. Donovan Bailey said there's racism in Canada, it's just politer. And we have to own that, and we have to fight that, and we have to do better.
All right, well, thank you all to our panelists, our speakers, Minister, Wendy, thank you to our wonderful audience that joined us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and don't forget to go to the website and read the report. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Michelle.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.